Hello, I'm Li Hao. So we have learned a lot and we have come a long way. We've learned how to use a store, how to create a store. We have learned how to create an action, how to use an action. And we have learned how to compose or create components, how to share data across components, how to create slots where you can insert some contents from your component into somewhere that you will insert into the inner components, right? And we learn about how to transfer data across. We've also learned about how you can dispatch an events from components or dispatch events from elements. We've learned a lot, and today we're gonna try to use all of them, all of the things that I've mentioned so far, into one example, which is how are we going to create an infinite list. So what is an infinite list? You probably have seen this kind of UI where you scroll and scroll, and as you scroll, it loads more data, and then if you scroll, it loads more data, and it keeps scrolling infinitely. And we are addicted with this, especially in social media, where you keep scrolling and keep seeing new content where you just can't stop scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And we're going to create this components called infinite list, whereby you can pass in different kind of data to this component, and you can decide how to render, or how does each item within the infinite list looks like. So this will involve in how we compose our components. So first thing first, let's take a look at this REPL that I have kind of prepared. Actually, nothing much over here except that I've created a few files. The app, the list component, which we are gonna do, the data.js. So this is where we're gonna fetch the data, and an action, use Viewport action. You probably have seen this, we probably have done this before in the previous video where I showed how I create this Viewport action. So links in the description if you haven't seen that before. So over here, app.svelte. Let's imagine how we are gonna use this infinite list. So most likely, or this is how I imagine, right? I'm gonna share how I come up with this, and if you disagree or something, let's comment down below and let's discuss about it. So this is how I would imagine my list component will be used, right? Usually when you come up with a component, you probably, instead of like there's two ways, right? First is you want to experiment, you want to play with it, then yeah, go ahead, go heads down to the component and try to experiment with something. But sometimes on the other hand, when you want to design a component, you want to think in terms of how you want to use it, how you want to allow people to use it, and then figure out how to provide that behavior. So over here, I'm imagining that I have a list component. Okay, I have a list component where I can pass in data, right? I can pass in data like this, right? So this will be an array of elements. Okay, so this is empty array for now. And I would imagine that I would have also ways to get, so this list will render an infinite list, right? So for each of the elements, I probably want to define like how each of the elements will show, right? So for each of the elements, probably I have a variable called a item. Over here, item is like one of the item of the list of arrays. So I don't have to do like a for each loop within, like in this app, right? So the list will do that looping of creating each of the items whenever they need. All I need over here is I let item, and I probably will able to say maybe show some contents for each of the item, right? Something like this. Right, this is what I would imagine my component will look like. I pass in a list, a data, and then for each of the item, I can bind it, and then I probably will show like how each of the item will show. And then probably I also would have maybe an event called load more. So this will prompt me to load more data, right? Fetch more data, so that so most likely this will be called when I scroll to the end of the list. So this is roughly how I would imagine my list would look like. Of course, there may be more things, say for example, loading. You never know like whether you are loading or not, or yeah, you never know whether you are loading or not, right? So I could pass in as a props, or probably maybe like load more is maybe it's like a async function. So then maybe I don't need loading, right? So every time when I call load more, I would just wait for it, and when it's done, I would when it's pending, then I will show a loading icon indicator, and when it's done, and I don't need it, right? So then in that case, I don't even need to pass in a props called loading. And probably one more thing that is maybe like no more data, right? This is helpful when you scroll to the end of list and you realize actually there's no more data to fetch, right? Maybe this can be a props, or maybe we can somehow indicate from the load more. I don't know, but this is one way, right? So the way I design it this way, which means that in this app.svelte, I would have to define what is the data and how do I load the data, right? Of course, there's a lot of different ways of designing this list, this infinite list component. It could be that your load more will always return the next items, right? Then probably you would not need this data props, because every time when you call load more, you will try to, the list itself will handle like appending, will maintain a list and appends it, right? There's another, that could be another way of doing it. But for now, I probably will keep it simple where list itself will handle that, right? So probably you'll come here, you call a fetch more, we will update this data and we'll pass the data down to the list component, right? Of course, you can tweak around if you want to. Feel free to grab the REPL link in the description and play around and try out different ideas you have. So first thing is, so this is what we're going to do. And first thing is, let's come up with an API, or what is the data they're going to show, right? I found this lorem pixum, which gives us a lot of mock photos, and there's this link list API where I can call, where it has a page ID and a limit, so that I can keep calling for get the next page. So I probably will gonna use this and use this to show images, right? So probably my item would have a, say, download URL, which is the image URL. So if I click this is the image URL. So I probably would have a download URL over here. So here I let item, right? I could have used item, but I can also assign it to a different variable, right? I think we've learned that, where we can say another variable and use like another variable here. We can rename the variable name, right? And actually you could also, if you don't know, you could also destructure it and use this download URL instead. So here in my list, probably I would have image source as the download URL, and probably also have like maybe the author, where I could use this author as the alt. All right, I'm gonna say taken by stunning view taken by author. Right, this is just to show that I could destructure and have a take out different properties of the let. Okay, now let's since we have this API, now let's try to implement the data, right? Okay, so first thing is I probably will use a writable data, so that whenever I change, it changes, your component get notified, and then you would render, right? So here I will say import writable from Svelte store. Of course, you could use a normal data, and then in the app itself you can update that variable, right? So if I put it in an external file, then most likely the best way to update and get notified is through a writable. Here I'm gonna define some variable, say maybe loading false. I have a no more data false, and then I have my page. So this will increment every time when I fetch, and then maybe I have my data over here as an empty array. So the first thing I'm gonna define is the list, which is the writable. Alright, so this I'm gonna have the data itself and the no more data. I think I probably would want to this the same name, so it's easier for me to do to assign to use it later on. Okay, so this is the list writable. I could have just export this list writable, but I also I want to also add more methods to this list to the store that I'm going to export, and also remove some of the methods, right? So here is the final store that I would have is I'm going to have a subscribe method. Right, subscribe is a must for to be considered as a store according to the store contract. But I don't want to expose the sets and the updates method, right? So I don't want the user of this data, this image list data to update it, to modify it. I don't want to expose the sets and update. I just want to expose subscribe. But I also want to add one more method, which is called fetch more. This will allow the user of this store to call this and fetch more data, right? So later on, I will probably come over here and load more. I will say the store.fetch more. Right? I would call this to fetch more data. Yep. So before that, let's come over here and say, okay, so now when I call this, I maybe just make some checks first. For example, if it is loading, or there's no more data, then probably will just end immediately, so nothing happens, right? But then I would say loading to be true, and next I would come over here and actually fetch the data, right? So call fetch, copy this API and use so the page will be page. Okay, I'm gonna say ++, then limit, I'm gonna say just limit to 10 items every fetch. So here I'm gonna get a response from awaiting this fetch API, and I would also need to await for the response to after I get a response, I'm gonna get the JSON format of I'm gonna JSON data of the response body. So I'm gonna say data. Okay, I don't want to use the same variable over here. Okay, I'm gonna say new data equals to await response JSON, and then okay, so now I'm gonna update this loading. It's gonna be false now, and then no more data will be depends on how many data that I have. So this returns me an array, right? So if I go to the extreme end, say 100, then I get empty array. So which means that if the new data.length equals to 0, then it's no more data. And now my data needs to be updated. I'm going to push all the new data in. And finally, I'm going to update my store, right? So I'm going to say list.set. Here, I'm going to data and no more data. So I'm going to update my list. Okay, so there we have it. And now we're going to import from data. So this is going to call data from data. So this is not store, this is the data.fetch more. So I'm going to create an async function that calls and return fetch more. Right? This can be simplified to just pass in like this, right? Data.fetch more. And over here, because my store value has data and no more data, I could actually just spread it, right? I can just spread the data, right? Because the value of the star is an object with data and no more data. I can spread this instead of having to come over here and data and data no more data, right? I can spread it instead. Okay, that is done, and we have that done, which is nice. And now let's take a look at the list component. Okay, so in the list component, I need first to create some of the props that we're passing in. So the first thing is the data, and next is the no more data, right? And then yep, that's it. And because over here we have an event from this component, so probably we also want to import create event dispatcher. Right, so you will create a dispatch method to dispatch this, to dispatch a to dispatch a load more event later on. Right now, I'm gonna create a list. So firstly, I'm gonna have unordered list. Whoops. And we're gonna use each to loop through the data. So each data as item. And loop through each of the data. Over here, I could use a keyed each block if I want to. Or okay, let me think. Yeah, we can use key each block, right? So that if we somehow reorder them, then it's useful. But let's leave it at this first. But if you want to use a key each block, you would have to decide what as the key, the attribute to treat as the key each block. And if we're gonna do that, but we have no idea in this list component to know what is the what are the attribute of this item to be treated as the key for each of the item, right? Then probably you would have to say export let key. You would have to have it as a props and ask maybe the user of it to define like, okay, so the key should be ID, right? Because we can see over here for each of the item, ID is kind of unique. So I can come over here and say item ID is the key. Sorry, item key is the key. And key in this case is a string ID. So in my each block, what I need to do now is actually to create each of the list item and have a slot. So slot is where you pass in this where we have a default slot. So whatever is being written over here, this is being inserted into the slots, right? So as we loop through, we create one list item and every list item will have its slots. And for the slots, for each of the different slots that we have that we iterate through, we can actually pass a different item data, right? We can pass a different item. So over here, maybe the first item, so the item will be the first item, the second, first image, second image, third image. And so for each of the slots elements that you create, maybe you create, because of the each block, you have 3 slots elements and each of them has a different item, right? So each of them will actually insert a different image from here because this image takes in the props of the item and takes the download URL as a source, right? Each of the download URL is different, so you have a different image. Okay. So although I'm not quite sure why is it not. Oh, okay. So the next thing is we haven't fetched the data. That's why we are seeing nothing over here. So to fetch the data, we're gonna create another list item. And this list item, I would be, let's see. I'm gonna come over here. Okay, use Viewport. I'm gonna import the Viewport. Use Viewport action. And I'm going to use viewport for this list element. Okay, so if no more data, if no more data, then probably we would not need to use this again, right? This list item, this last list item will have the viewport so that we know that when it's entering the screen. So you call enter viewport event on enter viewport. So when it enters, what we want to do is actually to call fetch more data, right? So over here, instead of calling a method, we are dispatching a new event called load more. So here I'm gonna say load more. Yeah, I could have what's that? I could have used the event forwarding by forward the enter viewport instead. So if I don't do anything, then this will actually create whenever this event happens, it will dispatch a new event from this component called this enter viewport, right? That's where you see this is being called and fetch more data. But I for the sake of better naming, because it does not make sense of list to have a enter viewport events, so I'm going to come here and dispatch action myself. I'm going to say here and dispatch enter viewport. Sorry, not enter viewport, but load more. Right. Okay, so the image is a bit too big, so I'm going to come over here and maybe have a style width equals 100%. So I have a smaller image. Right now, as you can see my scroller, if I scroll to the end, this enters and it will load more, right? The image just now is like it's trying to load the image, right? And as I scroll down, you see that it will load more image is being loaded. So every time when I scroll, when this list item enters the viewport, you will see that the viewport enter viewport event will be dispatches. And here I handle it by dispatch a new component event called load more. Over here I listen to that and fetch more data. Initially I was planning like maybe to use this to give us like the loading, but then because events, when you dispatch events, it's kind of like decoupled. You don't really get whatever is returned from this events handler. So probably I would want to pass in loading into exports. Let's loading. In here, so that you know when it's loading, if loading, I'm gonna show a text called loading. But we haven't passed this loading in, right? We haven't passed loading. So I can come over here and maybe have this loading as part of the writable as well. So loading over here. So that means when I set loading to true, I also need to update the store by set loading to true, right? I could use sets. I could also, because of writable, I could also come over here and say update. So I have my original say data, and then I return as takes in a function and returns, right, the current list, and I can create a new list by setting loading only. Wait, so what's this? Okay, I need to return new current list. I can do this as well. Now I have my loading. I'm not sure this is easier to read. Probably I'm going to change it back to just to this. This is much simpler to my eyes, right? In terms of like the effect is roughly the same. It's simpler to my eyes to read this, right? So now you can see when I scroll down, you will see loading, and then you load more data, and then you kind of show more data. Right, so what you've seen over here is probably we didn't really mention it, but it's possible where you can have multiple slots elements in a component, and you can have multiple slot. This slot is the same slim slot name, right? This is a default slot, right? If you can have a different name, maybe like item, and you can come over here and have like image as a slot attribute called item, then they are the same. This is still inserting into the slot, right? So you can have multiple slots elements in a component, and you can create them using if, each, or all, any logic blocks that you can think of. You can have a lot of those kind of slots, and for each of the slots you can actually pass in different data, right? I'm passing in different item props. Now you get different item over here for each of these slots, and so that you can show different data inside. You can create a different image for each of the item, right? We can create different image over here. So here you go. Here is how we create an infinite list using all the techniques or knowledge that we have learned so far. We learned about how we can create a writable store, custom writable store. Basically, you have different methods to the writable store. We learned about actions, although we didn't write an action today, but we use it, right? Inside this list components. And in the component wise, we learn about how to create components, how to create slots elements, and how to have slot attributes to insert into them, right? How we can pass data in. So we are passing an item from the list components to this main component. We learn about events. So list, we are listening events from an item. We are also dispatching a new event called load more, so that you can fetch more data over here. We learned about spreading. Yeah, we've done spreading over here as well. So here you go, how you can combine all the knowledge you've learned into an infinite list. So if you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. And if you think this is worth it to tell to your friends, share this video, right? And as always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next one is out. So see ya, bye bye.